The last survivor's oath. The battlefield stretched for miles, a desolate expanse of twisted metal and scorched earth under the eerie light of twin alien moons. Lieutenant Ethan Grayson, a seasoned officer of Earth's Expeditionary Corps, scanned the ruins with sharp, alert eyes. The war between the coalition of allied species and the ruthless Zorthan Empire had turned this once thriving alien colony into a graveyard. The air reeked of burnt circuitry and the faint metallic tang of spilled alien blood. Ethan's armor, battered and streaked with soot, bore the scars of countless battles. His enhanced HUD flickered, struggling to pick up any life signs. Yet his instinct told him there was still something, or someone, alive in this wasteland. He gripped his plasma rifle tightly, its weight a reassuring constant, as he moved cautiously through the rubble-strewn streets. His unit, the famed Earth's Vanguard, had fought valiantly to defend this outpost alongside their alien allies. But the Zorthan ambush was too swift, too overwhelming. Now, as far as Ethan could tell, he was the last human standing. His breath fogged up the cracked visor of his helmet as he muttered, "Damn it. Is anyone out here?" A faint noise, a rasping groan, caught his attention. His head snapped to the right, and he crouched behind a mangled piece of alien machinery, every muscle in his body tense. The groan came again, this time clearer, more desperate. Slowly, he moved toward the sound, rifle raised and senses on high alert. Ethan stopped short at the sight before him. Half buried under a massive chunk of debris was an alien figure, a member of the Azari, a species known for their unmatched combat prowess and unwavering honor. The warrior's lavender-toned skin shimmered faintly under the moonlight, and her long crystalline hair fanned out beneath her in a halo of iridescence. "Help, please," she rasped, her voice a haunting melody tainted with pain. Ethan hesitated, his training clashing with his humanity. Protocol was clear. Immobile casualties in enemy territory were to be abandoned. But as he looked into her stormy silver eyes, filled with both anguish and determination, he knew he couldn't walk away. "Hold on," he said, his voice steady. "I'll get you out of there." The Azari warrior's gaze hardened. "No. Leave me. Save yourself. The Zorthans. They'll be back." "Yeah, not happening," Ethan replied, already working to shift the heavy debris. His muscles strained as he heaved the chunk of alien metal off her torso. Beneath it, her armor was shattered, and her legs were twisted at unnatural angles. Blood, thick and glimmering like liquid starlight, pooled around her. "What's your name?" he asked as he carefully assessed her injuries. "Lyrian." "Commander of the Azari 2nd Strike Unit," she managed, her voice growing weaker. "Well, Commander Lyrian, I'm Lieutenant Ethan Grayson, and we're getting out of here. Stay with me." "You're defying orders," she whispered, a faint smile ghosting across her lips. "Story of my life," he quipped, pulling out a medkit from his armor. He injected her with a coagulant designed for Azari physiology, then patched the worst of her wounds with biofoam. Lyrian winced, but said nothing, her pride refusing to show pain. "They'll kill us both," she murmured. "Then we'll make it a hell of a fight," Ethan said, his voice resolute. He hoisted her carefully onto his back, her weight barely noticeable thanks to his exosuit. The moment he stood, his HUD blared with warnings, multiple hostile signatures converging on their position. "Looks like the welcoming committee is here," Ethan muttered, adjusting his grip on his rifle. Lyrian's voice was firm despite her injuries. "They hunt in packs, triangular formations. The visible ones are bait." Ethan nodded, appreciating her insight. "Got it. You call the shots. I'll do the shooting." The first wave of Zorthan soldiers emerged from the shadows, their insectoid forms skittering unnaturally fast across the rubble. Ethan didn't hesitate. He opened fire, the plasma rounds searing through the air and tearing into the enemy. Lyrian, despite her injuries, barked precise tactical advice, her warrior instincts sharp as ever. Two more flanking left. Take the high ground, she commanded. Ethan pivoted, launching himself onto the remains of a fallen structure. From the elevated position, he had a clear shot at the flanking Zorthans. One after another, they fell, their chitinous armor no match for his marksmanship. "You're good," Lyrian said, her voice tinged with grudging admiration. "Yeah, well, you're not bad for dead weight," Ethan shot back with a grin, earning a soft chuckle from the warrior. As the last of the immediate threats were neutralized, Ethan took a moment to catch his breath. But Lyrian's sharp intake of breath drew his attention. "What now?" he asked. She pointed to a distant structure partially concealed by smoke. "There. A Zorthan command ship. If we reach it, we might find a communication relay, or a med pod." "Risky," Ethan said, considering the odds. Lyrian's eyes gleamed with determination. "If we stay here, we die. If we move, we have a chance." Ethan grinned. "I like the way you think." As he began moving toward the command ship, he couldn't help but marvel at the strength of the injured warrior on his back. Her courage and tactical brilliance were a stark contrast to the cold, clinical orders he had followed for years. For the first time in a long while, Ethan felt a spark of something he thought he'd lost: hope. And so, with an unyielding Nazari warrior on his back and the odds stacked against them, Ethan set off into the chaos. The battle wasn't over. In fact, it was only just beginning. Into the fire. The smoldering battlefield gave way to an eerie quiet as Ethan pushed forward, Lyrian's injured form secured on his back. Each step toward the distant Zorthan command ship brought them closer to potential salvation, or certain doom. The moons hung low in the alien sky, casting an otherworldly glow over the jagged wreckage, as though the universe itself watched their struggle. "Your breathing is steady," Lyrian noted softly, breaking the silence. Her voice carried a mix of curiosity and admiration. "Human adaptability," Ethan replied with a smirk. "Or maybe I've just gotten used to running straight into hell." She chuckled weakly, a quality I find both admirable and infuriating. As they moved through the ruins, Lyrian's tactical instincts guided them. "There," she whispered, pointing to a cluster of collapsed structures. "Zorthan patrols avoid enclosed spaces unless necessary. We can use that as cover." Ethan adjusted his approach, weaving through the debris with practiced precision. His augmented exosuit muffled his steps, while his HUD scanned the shadows for movement. Lyrian's weight was a constant reminder of their precarious situation, but he refused to let it slow him down. They reached the edge of a partially collapsed transport depot, its twisted beams forming a jagged canopy overhead. Ethan crouched behind a shattered bulkhead, setting Lyrian down gently. "Rest here for a moment," he said, checking his surroundings. "I need to scout ahead." "No," Lyrian said firmly, her storm-gray eyes locking onto his. "We stay together. You'll need my knowledge of their patterns if we're to survive." Ethan hesitated. "You're injured, and still more useful than you alone," she interrupted, her tone brooking no argument. "Fair enough," he said, helping her to a more upright position. Lyrian's fingers brushed over the alien console embedded in her damaged armor. With a faint hum, her suit projected a small holographic map of the area. "This," she said, pointing to a blinking marker, "is the command ship's perimeter defense system. Zorthans rely heavily on automated turrets and motion-detecting drones. We'll need to disable them before we can get close." Ethan studied the map, his brow furrowed. "And how do we do that without getting fried?" "By using the environment to our advantage," Lyrian replied. She gestured toward a series of collapsed buildings near the command ship. "If we detonate one of those fuel cells, the blast should overload their sensors temporarily. It'll give us just enough time to slip past." "Just enough time to get ourselves killed," Ethan muttered. "Do you have a better idea?" He sighed, a reluctant smile tugging at his lips. "Not really. Let's do it." As they moved deeper into the depot, the air grew colder, the oppressive silence broken only by the occasional crackle of distant fires. Ethan's HUD picked up faint heat signatures ahead. Zorthan patrols. He signaled Lyrian to stay low as they approached the fuel cells. The massive cylindrical tanks hummed faintly, their surfaces marred by scorch marks from the earlier battle. Ethan crouched beside one, his fingers tracing the control panel. "This is going to be loud," he said, glancing at Lyrian. "Better loud than dead," she replied, her lips curving into a faint smirk. Ethan set the charges with practiced ease, his movements swift and precise. As he worked, Lyrian kept watch, her sharp eyes scanning the shadows. "They're coming," she whispered, her voice tense. Ethan glanced over his shoulder. A trio of Zorthan soldiers emerged from the ruins, their insectoid bodies glinting in the moonlight. He grabbed his rifle, but Lyrian's hand on his arm stopped him. "Wait," she said. "Let them come closer. Use the explosion as cover." Ethan nodded, his grip on the rifle tightening. The Zorthans moved with an unsettling grace, their segmented limbs clicking softly against the ground. "Now," Lyrian whispered. Ethan triggered the charges, and the night erupted in a blinding flash of light and heat. The fuel cell exploded, sending a shockwave rippling through the depot. The Zorthans were thrown off their feet, their chitinous armor cracking under the force. Ethan didn't wait to assess the damage. He scooped Lyrian onto his back and sprinted toward the command ship. The explosion had done its job. The perimeter defenses flickered and died, their systems overwhelmed by the sudden energy surge. "Keep your head down," Ethan shouted as plasma fire erupted around them. The surviving Zorthans recovered quickly, their weapons blazing as they pursued the fleeing pair. Ethan zigzagged through the rubble, his enhanced reflexes keeping him one step ahead of the enemy. "Left," Lyrian shouted, and Ethan pivoted without hesitation. A plasma bolt sizzled past his shoulder, missing by inches. They reached the base of the command ship, its massive form looming overhead like a dark monolith. Ethan ducked into a narrow alcove, pressing his back against the cold metal. "We're not out of this yet," he muttered, his breathing heavy. Lyrian nodded, her expression grim. "The entrance is heavily guarded. We'll need to create another distraction." Ethan's mind raced as he surveyed their surroundings. His gaze fell on a stack of Zorthan supply crates, their contents glowing faintly through reinforced glass. "Are those what I think they are?" he asked, pointing. "Energy cores," Lyrian confirmed. "Highly unstable. A single shot could set them off." Ethan grinned, his adrenaline surging. "Perfect. Stay here." Before Lyrian could protest, he dashed toward the crates, his movements swift and silent. He fired a precise shot, and the cores erupted in a cascade of fiery explosions. The Zorthan guards scrambled in confusion, their focus diverted. "Move," Ethan shouted, running back to Lyrian. With the enemy disoriented, they slipped through the unguarded entrance and into the heart of the command ship. The dimly lit corridors pulsed with an ominous red light, and the sound of distant alarms echoed through the metallic halls. "Where to now?" Ethan asked, his rifle at the ready. "The central control room," Lyrian said, her voice steady despite the chaos. "From there, we can shut down the ship's systems and call for reinforcements." Ethan nodded, his determination hardening. "Let's finish this." As they moved deeper into the ship, the weight of their mission pressed heavily on Ethan's shoulders. Failure wasn't an option, not for him, not for Lyrian, and not for the countless lives depending on their success. The battle wasn't just for survival anymore. It was for something far greater, the heart of the enemy. The command ship's interior was a stark contrast to the chaotic battlefield outside. The narrow corridors hummed with the low vibration of alien machinery, illuminated by pulsating red emergency lights. Ethan's steps echoed softly against the sleek metallic floors as he moved cautiously, Lyrian's faint breathing a steady reminder of her fragile state. The Zorthan ship wasn't just a vessel. It was a labyrinth, each corner promising either salvation or death. Lyrian shifted slightly on Ethan's back, her voice a whisper in his ear. "This layout, it's different. They've modified it." "Modified how?" Ethan asked, his rifle sweeping the hallway ahead. "They're using advanced shielding and automated defenses," she explained. "The central control room will be heavily fortified. If we're caught before we reach it." "We won't be," Ethan cut her off, his tone firm. "Not while I'm breathing." Her storm-gray eyes softened, though she said nothing. Despite the pain etched on her face, there was an undeniable strength in her expression, a warrior's resolve. The ship suddenly shuddered, and a distant mechanical roar echoed through the halls. Ethan froze, his heart pounding. His HUD flared with warnings. "Motion detected. Proximity increasing." "They know we're here," Lyrian said grimly. "No kidding," Ethan muttered, backing into a shadowed alcove. He set her down carefully, positioning himself between her and the approaching threat. "Stay behind me." The first drone appeared seconds later, its insect-like frame gliding effortlessly through the air. Its glowing red sensors locked onto Ethan, and a sharp whine signaled its weapon systems powering up. Ethan fired first, his plasma rifle sending a searing bolt straight into the drone's core. The explosion lit up the corridor, but the noise only summoned more. Within moments, 3 more drones emerged, their sleek forms darting toward him with lethal precision. "Focus fire on the sensor arrays," Lyrian called out, her voice sharp despite her weakened state. Ethan nodded, adjusting his aim. His shots were precise, each one striking the vulnerable spots Lyrian had identified. The drones fell one by one, their shattered remains clattering to the floor. "More are coming," Lyrian warned, her gaze fixed on the corridor behind them. "We need to keep moving," Ethan said, reloading his rifle. He reached for her, but she shook her head. "I can't. I'm slowing you down," she said, her voice filled with frustration. "Not a chance," Ethan replied, lifting her back onto his shoulders. "We're doing this together." As they pushed deeper into the ship, the defenses grew more intense. Automated turrets emerged from concealed panels, their energy blasts tearing through the air. Ethan ducked and weaved, his enhanced reflexes keeping him just ahead of the onslaught. Lyrian's tactical advice was invaluable. "Right panel, shoot the power node," she shouted as they faced another turret. Ethan's shot hit its mark, and the turret sparked violently before going dark. "You're good at this," he said, his voice tinged with admiration. "I spent years studying Zorthan technology," Lyrian replied. "And I don't intend to die in the belly of their ship." Her words only strengthened Ethan's resolve. They were close now. He could feel it. The faint hum of the central control room systems grew louder with each step, a beacon guiding them through the maze of corridors. Finally, they reached a massive set of doors, their surfaces etched with glowing alien runes. Lyrian's eyes widened. "This is it," she said, her voice hushed. Ethan examined the control panel beside the doors. It was unlike anything he'd seen before, a complex array of symbols and holographic projections. "Can you override it?" he asked. Lyrian nodded, though her movements were slow and deliberate. "I need a moment. And cover." "Take your time," Ethan said, positioning himself defensively in front of her. As Lyrian worked, Ethan's HUD flared with new warnings. Hostiles incoming. Multiple signatures. He gritted his teeth, his rifle at the ready. The corridor filled with the sound of clicking mandibles and skittering limbs as a squad of Zorthan soldiers rounded the corner. "Great," Ethan muttered. "More bugs." The first soldier charged, its serrated claws glinting in the red light. Ethan fired, his plasma bolts ripping through its armor. Another leaped toward him, its shrill screech echoing through the hall. He swung the butt of his rifle, smashing it aside before finishing it with a clean shot. "They're breaching the other end," Lyrian shouted, her voice trained. "I've got this," Ethan called back, though sweat dripped down his brow. The Zorthans were relentless, their sheer numbers threatening to overwhelm him. Lyrian's voice cut through the chaos. The doors opened. Ethan turned, his heart pounding as the massive doors slid apart to reveal the central control room. Without hesitation, He grabbed Lyrian and rushed inside, sealing the doors behind them. The room was a stark contrast to the rest of the ship, a pristine circular chamber filled with towering consoles and glowing screens. At its center stood the ship's command interface, a pulsating orb of energy suspended in midair. "That's it," Lyrian said, her gaze fixed on the orb. "The ship's neural core. If we can access it, we can disable the entire vessel." Ethan set her down gently, his eyes scanning the room. "What's the catch?" "The neural core is protected by a fail-safe system," Lyrian explained. "It requires simultaneous input from 2 operators. I can guide you through the process, but we'll need to move fast. The Zorthans won't give up easily." Ethan nodded, his determination unshakable. "Tell me what to do." As Lyrian activated the interface, the room came alive with a cascade of holographic symbols. Ethan followed her instructions, his hands moving swiftly over the alien controls. The process was intricate, each step requiring absolute precision. Outside, the sound of pounding grew louder. The Zorthans were trying to break through the doors. "We're running out of time," Ethan said, his voice tight. "Almost there," Lyrian replied, her focus unwavering. The neural core pulsed brighter, its energy surging as the final sequence was completed. A low rumble echoed through the ship, and the lights flickered. "It's done," Lyrian said, slumping against the console. Ethan reached for her, his relief short-lived as the pounding on the doors intensified. "Now what?" "We hold," Lyrian said, her eyes blazing with defiance. "And we make them pay for every step." As the doors buckled under the Zorthans' assault, Ethan stood ready, his rifle aimed, and his resolve stronger than ever. This was their stand, a fight for survival, for freedom, and for the hope that humanity and its allies could prevail against impossible odds. The battle wasn't over, but Ethan knew one thing for certain: they wouldn't go down without a fight. The turning point. The pounding at the massive command room doors reached a deafening crescendo, the reinforced metal groaning under the relentless assault. Ethan stood tall, plasma rifle poised, sweat trickling down his neck despite the cooling systems in his armor. Beside him, Lyrian was slumped against the console, her face pale but her storm-gray eyes still fierce. "They're coming," she said, her voice steady despite the evident strain. Ethan smirked grimly. "Let them. We'll give them a welcome they won't forget." The doors finally gave way with an ear-splitting crash, and the first wave of Zorthan soldiers poured in. They moved like a swarm, their insectoid forms shimmering under the room's dim red light. Their mandibles clicked in a nightmarish chorus, and their energy weapons glowed menacingly as they took aim. Ethan didn't wait. His rifle barked, each plasma bolt precise and devastating. The first 2 Zorthans went down, their armor splintering under the impact. He sidestepped a blast of searing green energy, his reflexes honed to perfection, and retaliated with a rapid burst that felled another. "Ethan, left flank." Lyrian's warning came just in time. He pivoted, firing into the cluster of soldiers trying to flank him. The explosion of a fuel cell he had targeted sent several of them sprawling, their chidnous limbs flailing. "Lyrian, how are we looking on reinforcements?" he called over the chaos. She was hunched over the console, her fingers deftly manipulating the alien interface. "I've sent out a distress beacon on all coalition frequencies, but the Zorthans are jamming most signals. We need to buy more time for the transmission to break through." "Time isn't exactly on our side," Ethan muttered, pulling a frag grenade from his belt. He hurled it into the thickest part of the swarm, and the ensuing explosion sent a shockwave through the room, scattering Zorthan bodies like leaves in a storm. Lyrian's voice was sharper now. "They'll bring in heavier units soon. Combat drones. Mechs. We need a plan, Ethan." He glanced around the room, his mind racing. The neural core at the center of the chamber pulsed with raw energy, casting shifting shadows across the walls. "That core," he said suddenly. "Can we overload it? Turn their own systems against them?" Lyrian's eyes widened. It's possible, but it's dangerous. The energy surge could destroy the entire ship, and us with it. Ethan shrugged, his smirk tinged with defiance. Not like we have a better option. Besides, if we're going out, might as well take them with us. Lyrian hesitated for only a moment before nodding. I can initiate the overload, but it'll take a few minutes to bypass the failsafes. You'll need to hold them off until I'm done. Minutes? Huh. Easy, Ethan said, his voice laced with sarcasm. The next wave of Zorthans arrived before he could even catch his breath. These were larger, more heavily armored soldiers, their segmented exoskeletons bristling with integrated weaponry. Behind them hovered sleek combat drones, their energy cannons charging ominously. Ethan's rifle spat plasma, each shot aimed with deadly precision. The drones were fast, darting through the air in erratic patterns, but his enhanced reflexes kept him one step ahead. He dropped one with a shot to its central processor and ducked behind a console as another's energy blast scorched the wall where he'd been standing. Lyrian, how's that overload coming? He shouted. Almost there, she replied, her voice tight with concentration. One of the Zorthan soldiers lunged at Ethan, its claws slicing through the air. He rolled to the side, narrowly avoiding the strike, and countered with a point-blank shot that sent the creature reeling. Another soldier charged, but Ethan met it with a knife-hand strike to its neck joint, exploiting a weakness Lyrian had pointed out earlier. The room was a whirlwind of chaos, the air thick with the acrid smell of plasma burns and the metallic tang of alien blood. Ethan's muscles burned with exertion, but he didn't slow. Every move was calculated, every shot deliberate. Behind him, the neural core began to pulse faster, its light intensifying. Lyrian's voice cut through the din. The overload sequence is locked in. We have 2 minutes before the core detonates. 2 minutes. That's generous, Ethan quipped, but his expression was grim. What's the exit plan? There's an escape pod bay 2 levels down, Lyrian said, but we'll have to move fast. Ethan glanced at the swarm of Zorthans still flooding into the room. Fast isn't exactly an option right now. Lyrian pushed herself upright, her face pale but determined. I can walk. Just get us out of here. Ethan hesitated, then nodded. Stay close to me. He slung his rifle over his shoulder, grabbed a secondary weapon, a compact energy pistol, and led the way. They sprinted through the chaos, Ethan firing sporadically to keep the Zorthans at bay. The ship's alarms blared, a deafening cacophony signaling imminent destruction. The corridors seemed to tilt and shift as the neural core's energy surged, destabilizing the vessel. Left, Lyrian shouted, and Ethan veered into a side passage just as a section of the ceiling collapsed behind them. The escape pod bay was in sight now, its doors mercifully intact. Ethan fired at the control panel, forcing the doors open, and shoved Lyrian inside. Get in the pod, he ordered, covering her as the remaining Zorthans closed in. Lyrian didn't argue. She climbed into the pod and activated the launch sequence. Ethan, come on. He fired a final burst at the advancing soldiers, then dove into the pod just as the doors sealed shut. The ship shuddered violently as the escape pod ejected, hurtling away from the doomed vessel. Through the small viewport, they watched as the command ship was consumed by a brilliant explosion. The neural core's overload sent shockwaves rippling through space, tearing the massive vessel apart in a cascade of fire and light. Ethan slumped back in his seat, his chest heaving. Well, that was a hell of a party. Lyrian managed a weak laugh, her gaze fixed on the debris-strewn void outside. We did it. Yeah, Ethan said, a faint smile tugging at his lips. We did. But even as relief washed over them, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that their fight was far from over. The Zorthans wouldn't take this loss lightly, and the war was still raging. For now, though, they had survived, and in the face of impossible odds, that was enough. Echoes of survival. The escape pod hurtled through the void, its automated systems working tirelessly to stabilize their trajectory. Inside, Ithan and Lyrian sat in tense silence, the faint hum of the pod's engines the only sound. The aftermath of the command ship's destruction still lingered in the air, a mix of relief, exhaustion, and the ever-present weight of what lay ahead. Ethan leaned back against the pod's bulkhead, his gaze fixed on the viewport. The remains of the Zorthan command ship glittered like dying embers against the backdrop of twin alien moons. "Hell of a way to end a night," he muttered, his voice heavy with fatigue. Lyrian, seated opposite him, was pale but alert. The coagulants and biofoam Ethan had administered earlier were holding, but her injuries were severe. Despite her pain, her silver-gray eyes remained sharp, analyzing the console display in front of her. "We're not safe yet," she said, breaking the silence. Her tone was steady, but there was an edge to it, a quiet urgency. Ethan turned his attention to her. "Let me guess. Zorthan ships inbound." "Not yet," Lyrian replied, "but they will be. The explosion from the command ship won't go unnoticed, and this escape pod doesn't have the cloaking capabilities to evade their sensors for long." "Great," Ethan said with a dry chuckle. "Guess we're back on borrowed time." He stood and moved to the pod's control panel, scanning the readings. The automated systems had plotted a course to the nearest coalition-aligned outpost, but it was days away at their current speed. They didn't have that kind of time. "We need to find somewhere to lay low," Ethan said, his brow furrowing. "Someplace to patch you up and figure out our next move." Lyrian hesitated before nodding. "There's a possibility," she said, her voice thoughtful. "A former Azeri listening post on a nearby moon. It's abandoned, but it might still have functional medical equipment and supplies." "Coordinates?" Ethan asked. Lyrian input the data into the console, and a new trajectory appeared on the display. Ethan studied it, his lips tightening into a grim line. The moon wasn't far, but the pod's energy reserves were dangerously low. "Can we make it?" Lyrian asked, her gaze locked on Ethan's face. "We'll make it," he said firmly, though doubt gnawed at the edges of his mind. With a few adjustments to the navigation system, the pod veered toward the desolate moon. Outside the viewport, the stars blurred into streaks of light as the craft accelerated. A shattered sanctuary. Hours later, the escape pod broke through the moon's thin atmosphere, the faintest vibrations rattling the interior. Ethan's grip tightened on the console as the automated landing systems struggled to compensate for the rocky terrain below. "Brace yourself," he called out to Lyrian. The pod hit the ground with a jarring thud, skidding across the barren surface before finally coming to a halt. Dust and debris swirled around them, obscuring the view outside. Ethan exhaled sharply, releasing the tension in his shoulders. "Not exactly a smooth landing, but we're here." Lyrian gave him a faint smile. "I've had worse." Ethan opened the hatch, and a rush of cold, dry air swept into the pod. He stepped outside, his boots crunching against the moon's rocky surface. The landscape stretched out in every direction, a desolate expanse of jagged peaks and endless craters, illuminated by the dim light of the twin moons above. "This place screams welcome," Ethan muttered as he turned back to help Lyrian. She leaned heavily on him as they exited the pod, her movements slow and deliberate. Her injuries were taking their toll, but she refused to show weakness. "There," she said, pointing to a distant structure half buried in the rocky terrain. The Azeri listening post was little more than a crumbling dome, its surface weathered and scarred by time. Yet, as they approached, Ethan noticed faint lights flickering along the perimeter, a sign that some systems were still operational. "Looks like we've got power," he said, his tone cautiously optimistic. They reached the entrance, and Lyrian activated the control panel with a series of intricate hand movements. The ancient Azeri technology responded sluggishly, but the doors eventually creaked open, revealing a dark, cavernous interior. "Stay here," Ethan said, helping Lyrian to a seated position just inside the doorway. "I'll check it out." She nodded, too exhausted to argue, and Ethan moved deeper into the structure. The interior was a labyrinth of narrow corridors and empty chambers, lit only by the faint glow of emergency lights. Dust covered every surface, and the air smelled stale, but the systems hummed faintly, a sign of life in the otherwise abandoned outpost. In one of the larger chambers, Ethan found what he was looking for, a medical bay. Though outdated, the equipment appeared functional. He activated the main console, and a holographic interface flickered to life. "Lyrian," he called out, his voice echoing through the empty halls. "We've got a med bay. Let's get you patched up." A fragile alliance. Ethan worked quickly, guiding Lyrian onto the medical platform. The Azeri healing equipment was far more advanced than anything he'd seen, but its interface was foreign to him. "Can you operate this?" he asked. Lyrian nodded weakly, her fingers brushing over the controls. The platform hummed as it scanned her injuries, and a series of holographic diagnostics appeared above her. "This will take some time," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Time we might not have," Ethan replied, glancing toward the doorway. He set up a perimeter around the medbay, placing proximity mines he'd salvaged from the escape pod. If the Zorthans tracked them here, they'd be ready. As he worked, Lyrian watched him silently. "You could have left me back there," she said suddenly. Ethan paused, his hands tightening around the mine he was arming. "Not my style," he said without looking at her. "You risked everything for someone you barely know," she continued. "Why?" He turned to face her, his expression serious. "Because it's the right thing to do. Doesn't matter where you're from or what species you are, nobody deserves to be left behind." Lyrian's gaze softened, and for the first time since they met, her stoic facade cracked. "Thank you, Ethan," she said quietly. Before he could respond, the medbay console emitted a soft chime. Lyrian's treatment was complete, and a holographic display indicated significant improvement. She stood slowly, testing her strength. Though still weak, she managed a small smile. "I'm not at full capacity, but I'll survive." "Good," Ethan said, "because something tells me we're not done yet." As if on cue, his HUD flared with warnings. Multiple heat signatures approaching rapidly. The Zorthans had found them. Ethan's jaw tightened. "Looks like the party's here." Lyrian reached for her weapon, her expression hardening. "Then let's show them why we're still alive." Together, they prepared for the next battle, their fragile alliance forged in the fires of survival. The final stand. The distant rumble of approaching Zorthan forces echoed through the barren halls of the Azeri outpost. Ethan adjusted the strap of his rifle, his mind already calculating their limited options. Beside him, Lyrian steadied herself against a console, her freshly healed body still not at full strength, but her determination burning brighter than ever. "They found us faster than I expected," Ethan said, his tone dry. "They're relentless when cornered," Lyrian replied, her storm-gray eyes narrowing. "This isn't just a routine hunt anymore. They want revenge for what we did to their command ship." "Well," Ethan said, cocking his rifle, "let's make sure it's a fight they won't forget." Lyrian nodded, her crystalline hair catching the dim light as she activated the outpost's remaining defenses. The screens flickered, displaying a crude schematic of the surrounding terrain. The Zorthan forces were closing in from multiple directions, their heat signatures glowing ominously red. "This outpost was never designed for prolonged defense," she said grimly. "We'll have to be creative." "Creative's my specialty," Ethan replied with a smirk. "Reinforcing the weak." Ethan moved quickly, his boots crunching against the cracked floor as he secured their makeshift barricades. Salvaged metal plates, abandoned consoles, and even pieces of the escape pod were repurposed into crude fortifications. Lyrian, her movements still cautious but deliberate, worked to reroute power to the outpost's automated turrets. "These systems are ancient," she muttered, her fingers dancing across the console. "Half of them are offline, and the others, unreliable at best." "Unreliable's better than nothing," Ethan said, Just give me something that shoots. The first turret came to life with a mechanical wire, its targeting system scanning the perimeter. A moment later, another hummed into action. That's two, Lyrian said, exhaling heavily. Don't expect miracles. I'll take what I can get, Ethan replied. He returned to the med bay and retrieved the proximity mines he had set earlier. If the Zorthans breached the outpost, these would be their last line of defense. We need to funnel them, Lyrian said, her tactical mind already assessing the situation. Their numbers will overwhelm us in an open assault. The main corridor is our best choke point. Ethan nodded, placing the mines strategically along the corridor. Let's hope they're as predictable as you think. The first wave. The attack began with a low, resonating hum that shook the walls of the outpost. Ethan's HUD flared with warnings as the Zorthan forces reached the perimeter. From the viewport, he saw them emerging from the darkness, sleek, insectoid forms moving in perfect synchronization. They're testing our defenses, Lyrian said, her voice calm but tense. The first turret fired, its plasma bolts tearing through the lead Zorthan soldiers. The air filled with the acrid smell of burning chitin, and the attackers recoiled momentarily. Not bad, Ethan said, watching the turret work. But the reprieve was short-lived. The Zorthans adapted quickly, deploying combat drones that zipped through the air with uncanny speed. The turrets struggled to track them, their plasma bolts missing more often than they hit. They're targeting the turrets, Lyrian shouted. Ethan raised his rifle, taking aim at the nearest drone. His shot connected, sending the mechanical insect spiraling into the ground. Another drone darted toward the second turret, and Ethan fired again. But this time the drone evaded him and unleashed a barrage of energy bolts that reduced the turret to a smoldering heap. Well, that didn't last long, he muttered, retreating to the next defensive line. The Zorthans pressed forward, their numbers swelling as more soldiers poured into the outpost. Ethan and Lyrian held their ground, their weapons blazing. Each shot was deliberate, every move calculated, but the odds were stacked against them. This isn't sustainable, Lyrian said, her voice strained. We need a decisive advantage. The power play. Ethan's gaze fell on the schematic of the outpost, his mind racing. What about the core? He asked. Lyrian's brow furrowed. The power core. It's unstable. If it goes, the entire outpost will be destroyed. Exactly, Ethan said. If we can lure them into the main chamber and overload the core, we can take out the whole swarm in one shot. Lyrian hesitated, her instincts warning her against such a desperate move. But as the sound of Zorthan claws scraping against the metal walls grew louder, she realized they had no other choice. Fine, she said, but if we do this, there's no turning back. Wasn't planning on it, Ethan replied. Lyrian accessed the outpost's central console, her hands moving swiftly as she bypassed the core's safety protocols. The lights flickered, and a low rumble reverberated through the structure. I set it to overload in 5 minutes, she said. We need to hold the main chamber until then. Ethan nodded, his resolve hardening. Let's make it count. The final clash. The Zorthans surged into the main chamber like a tidal wave, their screeches filling the air. Ethan and Lyrian stood side by side, their weapons blazing as they fought to hold the line. A Zorthan soldier lunged at Ethan, its claws swiping inches from his face. He ducked and fired point-blank, the plasma bolt tearing through its chest. Another soldier closed in on Lyrian, but she moved with practiced precision, her blade slicing through its armor with deadly grace. They just keep coming, Ethan shouted over the chaos. Hold them, Lyrian yelled back. The core's almost ready. The room trembled violently as the power core reached critical levels. Sparks rained down from the ceiling, and the walls groaned under the strain. Fall back to the corridor, Lyrian ordered. Ethan covered her retreat, firing relentlessly as the Zorthans pressed closer. They reached the corridor just as the core emitted a deafening roar, its energy spilling out in blinding waves. "Now," Lyrian shouted, slamming the final override switch. The core detonated in a cataclysmic explosion, the shockwave ripping through the outpost and obliterating everything in its path. Ethan and Lyrian barely made it to cover as the blast consumed the Zorthan forces, their shrieks silenced in an instant. Aftermath. When the dust finally settled, the outpost was nothing more than a smoldering crater. Ethan helped Lyrian to her feet, both of them battered but alive. "Remind me never to follow your plans again," Lyrian said, her voice laced with dry humor. Ethan grinned. "Hey, it worked, didn't it?" She shook her head, but there was a faint smile on her lips. For now. As they gazed out at the desolate landscape, the faint hum of a coalition dropship echoed in the distance. Reinforcements had arrived, but their fight wasn't over, not by a long shot. Together, they stood, ready to face whatever came next.